Okay, good day. Welcome to the third webinar in the CMHDARN Research Skills webinar series about ethical research. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and in particular the land in which I am today, that of the Darug people, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My name is Grundle Rose, which you can probably see on the screen, and I have a varied background. I've got a PhD in the development of food preferences, after which, that's where my research career started, after which I worked in commercial food research for about 6 years, taste research, working sort of development of preference. I worked with children a lot, young people. Then I got sort of bored with that, became a registered psychologist. I've been working in the mental health sector for about 13 years in research and evaluation. And very different ethical environments, I'd say, between commercial food research and mental health AOD research. I'm a long-term member of the Research Ethics Consultation Committee of CMHDARN. I like to say I'm 65, so I've got lived experience of lots of things, perhaps too numerous to mention in a way. And random fact, I'm a life member and past president of Hepatitis New South Wales. Having got my past out of the road, this webinar will focus on the fundamentals of ethical research, how it adds value to a research project, a quick explanation of the process involved and why ethical research is essential. Presented both as a lecture, which will come first, and then panel discussion, and you'll be able to ask questions of the panel with using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have a fair bit of time at the end for us to answer questions and to discuss ethics in a bit more focused detail. First off, we'll hear from Diego Solba on the fundamentals and importance of ethical research. And that will be followed by a conversation between myself, Emily Deans and Diego, and that's where the question part comes into it as well. And so over to you, Diego, a short introduction and enlighten us on ethics in research.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. I'm really excited to be with you today. So my name is Diego Solba. I'm a lecturer in bioethics. So what that means is I do a lot of research around the ethics and politics related to public health primarily and public health research. So I've done research ethics in a number of different ways in different capacities throughout my career. So yeah, so today my goal is just to chat a little bit about why research ethics, including the what. So I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is where I'm currently, where I live and work. And I want to pay my respects to the heritage and culture and elders past, present, and emerging. So if you take away any one thing from today's talk, it's that research ethics is not about filling out forms, okay? Oftentimes we believe that, you know, it's an obstacle towards us doing the actual thing we want to do, which is research, and that's fair enough. I think that as someone who was once on a research ethics board back in Canada, it can definitely feel very procedural and as if you're not actually doing anything meaningful when you're going up for ethics review. But the point of research ethics really is about the protection of the participant from harm in the process of generating knowledge, right? So it really is the protection of the individual participant or subject, what have you. So I'm going to start with a small case study that I'll return to at the end, just to kind of ground some of the things I'll be talking about. I want to look very briefly at what's the purpose of research and why we do research. They're going to be obvious, but they really do help us think through the actual ethics part as well of research. We'll look a little bit at informed consent, privacy, and confidentiality. And then critically, I'm going to spend time looking at what are some of the key values or concepts behind things like informed consent, privacy, and confidentiality. And then, like I said already, I'll return to the case study at hand. Okay, so I took this case from, there's a case book put out by the Children's Bioethics Center there at the University of Melbourne. It's actually quite a great resource. And this is one of their cases, so I want to make sure I acknowledge that. So imagine you're a researcher and you're conducting research online of a pro-anorexia support group. And the method that you're taking is one of passive observation. So meaning that you're going to go in, you're going to read the message boards, see what's going on, but you yourself are not going to participate. You're not going to intervene in what you see, right? You're just going to observe. The purpose of this research is very well justified. You're interested in the lives and the well-being of individuals who suffer from anorexia. So you want to understand what's being said on these pro-anorexia boards, pro-anorexia support groups. One of the advantages of this passive observation is that the individuals who participate in this group are unguarded and are going to give you very honest comments, or not give you honest comments. They're going to provide the group with honest comments, which then will form part of the data that you collect. And moreover, it's an anonymous forum. And this is also important because that means that you're not collecting actual patient data, or in this case, not patient data, but subject or participant data. It's purportedly anonymous, right? So we can already start to think about what are some of the ethical issues that we might find in a case like this. So I will leave you to have this kind of brewing in the back of your mind. Again, we'll come back to this slide. So what's the purpose of research? So the purpose of research is to generate new knowledge by answering an empirical question. And I have empirical in brackets. You can be a historian conducting research, in which case you might have empirical work with primary documents, say, or something like that. But it's a different type of empirical work that we're interested in the context of mental health, right? Health research, oftentimes when we're talking about empirical research question, you're dealing with human beings. But critically, there are several assumptions when we think about that the purpose of research is to generate new knowledge. Again, these are really obvious. They're not tricky, but they're worth making explicit. So the assumption is that there is an unknown, and that research is, and I'm probably stealing this from somebody who I already forgotten who said this, but research is a step into the unknown. Okay, and so with that, there comes risks and uncertainty and so on and so forth, which we'll touch upon. So why do we do research is also really important. So if we're doing health research, or if we're doing mental health research or drug research, we're doing it in part or solely because we want to improve society. There are many other reasons why we would, we want to do research. We'll set those aside. But the assumption as to, why do we do research? It's to better, society. It's to contribute to society. Is to recognize that oftentimes, or not exclusively, but certainly oftentimes, it's a population level target, or it's a group level target, right? Even if it's a small cohort, what you're trying to do is extrapolate or generalize from your research question, from your project or study, towards population level benefit, right? To use that word. It's a bit clunky, but you'll see why I'm using it in a second. So to me, this is sort of a, again, this is the what and the why. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the national statement. Hopefully, if you haven't had a chance, I strongly recommend reading it. It's the main document for research ethics in Australia. It's put out by the NHMRC and the ARC as well. And here you're going to find research ethics discussed in very practical terms and a lot of it will center on, three practical concepts. Not solely, so this is not exclusively, but these are three things that we often think about and that researchers often think about in the context of their research with humans. So one is informed consent. So, when we think about informed consent, there's usually three parts to it. So there's the information provision component, right? So you as a researcher are letting the individual who is a participant know the ins and outs of the project, including potential risks of harm. There's the understanding component that's very important as well, right? So it's not a matter of just giving the information, but the individual, you need to be there to help the individual understand as best as possible. Obviously, that's also dependent on the other individual, the participant, but you have to make an effort to help them understand the information you're providing. And then finally, it's voluntary, right? Again, this kind of goes without saying, but the idea is that you ought not to coerce anybody into research. We often think in terms of, the Nuremberg Nazi trials, where it wasn't voluntary, obviously, it was atrocious, it was during the Holocaust, but there are other ways where voluntariness can, be curtailed or manipulated. So we want to be very conscious of that. Privacy and confidentiality are the two things, or are two things rather, that we want to protect when we're dealing with individuals, right? So privacy refers to the information obtained and the limited range of knowers. And we'll get into this a little bit in a second, why that's important. Whereas confidentiality, it has to do with the relationship between the researcher and the participant. So you as the individual conducting the research and the participant. So it's a relational concept. So if these are the three of the main things that we talk about a lot in the context of research ethics, the one question that might come up is, why is there so much attention on the individual if the goal of research is a population level benefit, right? So a moment ago we said, obviously, you're conducting research in part to share knowledge of some kind of generalizability. It's not necessarily the same as if, a quantitative study that's a drug trial is different than, a qualitative interview study. But the idea is that you're trying to get knowledge out there into the world, again, to benefit groups, to benefit society. But the attention of the protection is on the individual participant. So again, this seems obvious, but it really bears repeating, or it bears sort of bringing out to the fore. So generally speaking, the risk of harm in research is borne by the individual participant for the benefit of the broader population. Okay, so there are exceptions to this rule. As we get in, you can get into different designs, you can get into different contexts in which this doesn't actually hold, but we'll set those aside. Generally speaking, this is the case. And what I think is really important is to recognize that the participant is doing something altruistic by participating in research, right? They're doing something for the betterment, the same way that you're trying to improve society, improve an aspect, or gain, new knowledge for the sake of society. That individual is doing the same then, right? They're participating, and it's not for their own good. Now, there's issues around whether they think it's for their own good, but that, again, we can talk about that later if we'd like. But it really is their participation as individuals for the betterment of the group, right? So the risk of harm is borne on the individual participant. And so we have things like informed consent, we have things like privacy and confidentiality, but the part I want to argue today that this is probably slightly more unusual, I think, but maybe not, is that usually when we talk about research ethics, we just talk about those high level, very important, but sort of those high level concepts. And what I want to suggest to you, and we'll do this very briefly because again, we don't have as much time as you can go on and on about this. I know I can. I teach a whole unit on this at University of Sydney, so I can ramble on about this really well. So I'm checking my time. So there's a few key concepts that sort of, I would say, are foundational or motivate or animate the entirety of research ethics. Okay. One of these ideas is this idea of uncertainty, right? Again, your research is a step into the unknown. So by doing research, you're addressing uncertainty, right? It's another way of thinking. Research is trying to resolve some level of uncertainty. Critically, there's uncertainty in the design of the study or the project itself that raises ethical questions. So some of the sort of very common ones that we think about are things like bias and randomization. There's a whole host of issues around randomization in randomized control trials. There's a lot of issues around measurement. What is it that you're measuring when you think that you know what you're measuring? That can have actual real life implications in terms of you know, are the measures that you're using, are they racialized towards one group and away from another, such that they're not sort of transferable, so on and so forth. One other really important thing when we think in terms of the uncertainty that you're trying to control in the context of the design itself is the collection of sensitive data. And this, I think, really applies to probably folks on this webinar. The idea here is that sometimes you're collecting sensitive data. You might be collecting, say, experiences of these individuals who you know, are taking a particular drug or a particular situation. It's sensitive information. You also have to make a call as a researcher as to what you will collect and what you won't collect, right? So there might be some information that you think is just too touchy or too sensitive, or you know, it's not directly related to your question, but might be of interest. So you're making a call as to what you're collecting. And that's really important to think about as well, because if you're making a call about what's in, you're obviously making a call about what's out. And this is then going to affect that issue of uncertainty or the extent to which your research will answer questions, right? And there's values that often come into that decision, right? Oftentimes we think of it as a very sort of scientific, objective thing, and that's perfectly fine, it can be, but a lot of times there's very real ethical values that come into deciding what type of information we're collecting. The next concept that we really want to think about briefly is this idea of harm. Harm can obviously be physical, but oftentimes in the context of research, we're interested in non-physical harm. And again, for those of us who do a lot of qualitative research or survey research, perhaps, we're interested in these non-physical harms, right? We're interested in the emotional issues that might arise when you interview somebody with a particular lived experience, right? There's different ways of actually trying to articulate what exactly is a harm. I've given you one definition there. It's, you know, wrongful setback to interests or life opportunities, right? So it's not just any setback to your interests. It's when it's wrongful. I won't go into it a lot. Again, I'm happy to if there's questions about this, except to say that what seems on the surface really easy, which is how do you define harm, actually becomes really complicated really quickly. But again, we can sort of simplify it and think in terms of physical and non-physical harm. If we think about harms, if we're thinking about the individual placing themselves at a risk of harm in the context of research for the betterment of society, as I said a moment ago. When we think about risk of harm, right, oftentimes it's understood as a hazard plus a probability, right? So the hazard might be feeling emotional distress. What are the chances? Very low, right? You can maybe add a number to it. But critically, I think something that gets often overlooked is thinking about the cause and the distribution of the harm, okay? So part of the reason, okay, so the reason again that you're doing research is to sort of remove some uncertainty from the world. That means that there's a priori before you start, there is an actual uncertainty. And so the probability isn't really understood, right? You don't really understand. You're guessing as to what the probability of a hazard coming about, right? A bad thing or a harm coming about. But you also want to think about the cause and the distribution. is it always the same groups of individuals that we keep coming back to as researchers, right? Are they always the individuals who are bearing the brunt of research that improves the lives of their communities to various degrees, but definitely improves the professional careers of those conducting the research? So in Canada, for example, although I assume that there's probably something similar in Australia, but in Canada, Indigenous populations often say that they're over-researched, right? And there's not enough goes to those communities themselves. It's a very real criticism, right? So we can, by doing the research, impose harm, right? Or impose a risk of harm. And we need to also be conscious of, again, that distribution of the potential risk of harm as well. Finally, we're interested in individuals, we're interested in these individuals as autonomous people, right? So this is where you get things like informed consent. So what do I mean by autonomy? So autonomy is this idea that you're self-law-giving, or you're directing your life as you see fit towards certain ends, right? You're shaping your life. Usually the idea of autonomy is relational, right? We're not an island or an atom, right? We exist in relationships to family, friends, society, so on and so forth. From that, we create our identity, right? And our identity is often intersectional, okay? Again, there's various types of points that build our identity. We have agency and help build our identity as well. But again, it's always in relation to others with others. So that's what autonomy means. And it's the autonomous individual that you're trying to protect from risks of harms in light of uncertainty. Okay, right? So it's the autonomous individual who you're trying to protect from risks of harms in the context of research, which is a step into the unknown, which is a step into uncertainty. Okay? Critically, autonomy and informed consent aren't one and the same thing, right? There might be other ways of protecting autonomy that doesn't necessarily include informed consent. And this often comes apart in the context of public health research. There's tension between these two things. We'll set that aside again for now, but I just want to say, again, these two things aren't one and the same. So again, this is just a really simple diagram, but the idea here is that we have principles like informed consent, privacy, confidentiality that are important. That's the bread and butter. That's what the research ethics committees are going to be looking for. But underneath this is the critical values and concepts, okay? And that's what I really want to sort of, again, convey, that when we're interested a lot in the private, when we're interested in the forms that we have to fill out, and we're doing about the informed consent, privacy, confidentiality, it's important not to forget that there's these foundational values that play in the background. Just keeping track of time, I'll just quickly say, in a case like this, we can think about informed consent. There isn't informed consent because it's a public forum. You're just passive observation. But that happens to do with this idea of autonomy, right? Is there potential for harm? Is there risk of harm, right? Can people become identified? If they become identified, what then, right? What are certain things, how do you prepare for the unknown, right? How do you prepare your team so as to be flexible, to prepare for those things that may come up that you couldn't have predicted, right? So again, the ideas of informed consent, privacy, and these other foundational values, we can play with them with a very simple case like the one at hand. So I just want to stop there, and I want to bring back Brandon and Emily for the next portion of the talk, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Diego. Now I'd like to do some further discussion on ethical research by ringing the voices for those who've undergone the processes of ethical review. Emily, and I sit on an ethics committee, the Research Ethics Committee Consultation Committee of this CMHDARN organisation. And so first, Emily, you're the only person on the panel here who hasn't had a chance to introduce yourself, so go ahead.
Thanks, Gren. Hi, everyone. My name's Emily. I'll give you a bit of a background as to what I do currently for work. So I work in a small not-for-profit charity, a youth drug and alcohol harm reduction and prevention service. I've been with Youth Solutions for about 3 years, I think. So I think that's still pretty fresh, in my opinion. It's definitely my first sort of major job outside of doing my PhD. So a bit of a youngie and a freshie. Yeah, so my role there was really just to establish a research program. So really trying to understand the needs of young people, their drug and alcohol behaviours, their attitudes, what influences their behaviours. So you'll see me doing lots of interviews, lots of focus groups with young people, trying to create a safe space for them to be able to share their experiences. So that's, yeah, so alcohol and other drugs sort of for 3 years. And then prior to that, I was doing research in gambling. So predominantly with young men, lots of footy fans, lots of NRL and AFL fans. I learnt a lot about all sorts of stuff. Yeah, sort of trying to understand, I guess, the commercial factors and the environmental factors that influence their sports betting behaviours. So yeah, definitely a qual person. So I'm hoping I can chat to some of that today. Is that sufficient, Gren?
That's lovely, Emily. It's quite informative, and actually it means we've had one question so far, and I think the person's actually left because the second question I've got here says they've lost sound and they're lip reading Diego, and now I can't see them in the list of attendees anymore. And it's around that qualitative, quantitative, which is something I do quantitative research largely, and so this is sort of gets to the difference between those two types of research, or the perceived differences. So this question says, with ethical research, and the example talking about anorexia that Diego had, do the researchers aim for qualitative information, and it describes more personal information or quantitative research with numbers? That person has a background, has a lived experience of anorexia, and would more likely look at qualitative information. And is that a practical use of research to help others and not just be a number? So do you see that distinction, Diego and or Emily, between qualitative and quantitative? Does quantitative mean you have to be a number in research, do you think?
Good question. Diego, do you want me to put my tuppence worth in and then I can, yep.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. I think, yeah, with qual research, and it comes back to that point that Diego was sort of talking about at the very start about protecting your participants. So obviously qual or quant, you need to be protecting your participants, and ethical processes can help you do that. But I think being a qual researcher, if I can't create a space where a participant feels as if they can authentically and openly discuss their experiences with me, there's no point in me doing my research, if that makes sense. So if we're sort of bringing it back to how ethics adds value in that space of trying to understand qual, you know, that can, I guess, facilitate more authentic research through qual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely.
I think that one of the things that I didn't talk about, but is often in a lot of documents, it's in the national statement as well, is that in order for research to be ethical, there needs to be social value. There needs to be social and scientific value behind the research itself in the context of human studies. And that means that sometimes it means sometimes that you're always going to protect the human subject. You're always going to protect the participant. But part of what it means to do ethical research is sound design. And it means being really careful about the formulation of the question. So we often think about the development of a project independently of the ethics. And I think that the really savvy researcher, like you said, Emily, right? You're thinking about the well-being of your participant at the outset, as soon as you're writing your proposal, as soon as you're writing your protocol. And I think that's the right way to go. So I think more so than quant versus qual, it has to do with, is this the right research question? Is this research question worthwhile asking, right? Because that merit and value is so important. And I think starting from that, then you get that trickle on attention and care for the individual, or hopefully you do.
Yeah, and I'm thinking the lived experience lens at that point in time as well. At the start of research, the slogan, nothing about us without us, and
sure,
probably a good time to bring people in that have a lived experience of whatever it is you want to find out about, to direct the question and to add value at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And while I was preparing for this, I was thinking, I sort of have a slogan that if you're really focusing on ethics, then everything else sort of flows. Like you're saying there, Diego, part of ethics is having a sound design. So if you think about ethics, you have a sound design, you have a question that is going to benefit a community, you develop a process that isn't going to harm the people taking part in it, and you also bring outcomes and results that benefit the community you're trying to benefit, because that's been, well, if everything goes right, but that, it certainly makes it more likely if you've been considering those ethical steps every inch of the way. That's answering the question why ethical research is imperative. That to me is why it's imperative to act ethically, because you're more likely to get the outcome you want if you do.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly prudent. I think that's, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's, one reason why that I think you want to conduct research ethically. I think that's true. Yeah.
I think it also, sorry, Diego.
No, please, Emily, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think also, I don't know, I'm the type of person that is very aware that there's lots of things that I don't know and that there's lots of other professionals out there that can add their tuppence worth. They'll have different experiences, they'll have different training, different expertise. And I think one of the awesome things about being able to put your research project, your approaches, your research questions, all of it through an ethics committee is that you've got a whole panel of people to have a look and look through their lens, I guess. I guess assess whether you are asking the right questions for the right topics, and whether your approach to that is going to get you the best outcome and protect participants at the same time.
For sure.
Absolutely. I also, in preparing, I came across something called the Community Research Ethics Office, Diego, that you might be familiar with. Do you know?
In what context?
In Canada, in Ontario.
Okay. All right. I'm from Ontario, so there you go.
There you go. Yes. And I saw they put up 4 principles for research ethics: respect for persons, concern for the welfare of all involved in the research, concern for justice, and respect for community. And they're 4 basic principles.
And we see similar things in the national statement. We see similar things in the CMHDARN, which is a UN organization. We see it in the World Medical Association. I think one of the things that often gets lost is that we talk about these kind of superficially. And again, I think it's getting into the nitty gritty where you kind of see what actual respect for person looks like. So I'm wondering, given your experience as researchers, what have you found most difficult from an ethics point of view?
Great question.
Yes, it is. What's most difficult? Do you want to go first, Emily?
Sure, yeah. I think, yeah, I have a pretty unique position, I guess, because I came from a university system where the scaffolding was there, the systems were there to help me go through the processes quite fluidly, if that makes sense, or quite easy. And then once I finished my PhD, I went into sort of the not-for-profit space, who I think are still trying to play catch up a little bit when it comes to research and evaluation. I basically had to build the program from bottom up, from scratch kind of thing. So I didn't have the systems. I didn't have the scaffolding there to be able to go through a formal ethics committee. I had to sort of create those networks and really work quite hard at that. So I think if we're talking from I guess a not-for-profit charity space, I think one of the hardest things and a big barrier is just, you know, being able to access into those systems. And yeah, not everyone in those spaces might even have a research background. They might not have ever sort of navigated the whole ethics process. So I can appreciate that it's can be a daunting kind of topic, or daunting kind of process, if we use that word. Even ethics committees, I know you guys both sit on ethics committees, but they can be a bit intimidating as well. So I think, yeah, not being linked up with the right support systems, I think, for a not-for-profit space, I think it was much easier to go and get ethics and get ethics approval if you're already in a university or a health system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I overcame that, but it was through networking. I was just working in NGO, and I actually targeted someone at a dinner. I saw them walk in. We got invited to the same dinner. Walked in, sat down next to them. Eventually, got an adjunct position so I could get access to the ethics committee, and I overcame that challenge, and also access to the library, which is really important in if you're going to do researching. For me, in a way, the ethical point, and again, back to doing good research, the problem I've had, I tend to just go for it. You know, I've got this idea, yeah, it's great, let's go and do it. And it's sort of holding myself back and pausing and saying, well, yeah, okay, do it, but how can I do this better? And who should be involved in developing it up into something that looks like a research project? So that's actually a challenge for me, because I do like let's just do it and run ahead. And actually, I picked up some bad habits in commercial research, because you have your own kingdom there. There are no ethics committees, and you pay money to people, and that opens doors like you wouldn't believe. Walk into schools. We had virtually no access to schools when I was doing my PhD. But in commercial research, I could walk in there and feed them sweet foods, like I won't call them junk. Oh, I call them junk foods. That was, you just pay the money to the P&Cs. They get an air conditioner for their library. They get shade cloth for the playground, and we walked in there. But it took us 18 months to get permission from the Department of Education from the university.
That's a really interesting distinction of sort of the private public, because I think it goes to why you're doing the research, right? Like I'm I'm assuming that part of it, if you're private, it's for profit, right? If it's a for-profit company, then the emphasis is profit, you know.
It is all of it, Diego.
Right.
We weren't making the world a better place. The only advantage ethically I could see in that is that that we all introduce you sort of mentioned it before, we introduce biases into our research as we go. We may not even know we're doing it, but there's, we have our own particular views, which is another reason to involve more people in your research. And but because they're only interested, if a product goes up in the market, it fails, the company loses money. So they don't want that to happen. So they're really interested in the answer, and only the answer. So there's no biases, there's no agenda. They just want to know what works. So it had this sort of very pure aspect to it ethically,
right,
as well as this not very ethical aspect to it. And we're in it for the money, and there's no committees to guide us. We just do what we want.
I think it's really interesting just kind of hearing the discussion, the answer to those questions from both of you is we take for granted, or whenever take for granted, there's a lot of complexity in the relationship between these various parts. So there's complexity and there's nuance in the way that the values interact, right? Privacy and confidentiality don't make sense unless you think about autonomy, and, you know, uncertainty and risk of harm kind of go hand in hand. But also, Emily, what you were mentioning in terms of having the apparatus in a university and then having to build it all. It's doing research ethically, doing human research ethically includes so many unseen things happening in the background. And I think that really comes out in what you were saying.
Yeah. I had a supervisor once say to me, you know, you don't need ethics approval to do ethical research. And I thought that was awesome, because it was kind of like, you know, I think sometimes you can spend so much time thinking about the ethical implications of your work without having, obviously, you know, not saying don't go through ethics and all that kind of stuff, but I think sometimes people just treat it as a sort of a tick box exercise without actually putting in the thought behind the ethical implications of what they're doing. So from that perspective, I thought it was really helpful in trying to understand why we do this. So yeah.
But I think it's really important, because I think that research ethics boards also suffer from that, which is a lot of research ethics boards think that they are, research ethics boards or research ethics committees are translated into informed consent form readers, right? So what we do is we read your informed consent and we make sure it's up to the national statement standard, and then that's it, your research is ethical. Not all, so there's, again, I guess the thing that's important to note is that not all ethics committees are created equal, and that there is that variety. So even as someone, so I do a little bit of qualitative research in my capacity as a lecturer, and I've had terrible experiences with research ethics boards. And so I always make the distinction between, you know, doing research ethically versus going through a research committee are two different things. And hopefully they match up, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully that process helps, but not always. And that's just kind of a reality of it.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point about the different sort of ethics committees, because I think depending on the group of people that you are wanting to talk to and hear from, maybe it's worth, you know, doing a bit of background checks around, well, what would be the most appropriate ethics committee for this particular cultural group, or because there are lots of different ways. Yeah.
And representation, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and considering cultural groups, a whole other question as well. Working with different cultural groups and the sensitivities, and realizing the vulnerabilities of different groups that you work with as well.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, everyone, if you want to ask questions, there is a Q&A panel down there. And if we were allergic to questions, we're in the wrong business here as researchers. So feel free to ask anything you're interested in.
So there's a really interesting comment in the chat box. Sometimes I find IRB paternalistic. They decide who should complete a survey interview, particularly if it's with quote unquote vulnerable groups. Why not let the participants decide? IRBs decide for them. I'd love to hear your comments. I'll let the actual researchers tackle that one first.
Brand, I'll go after you.
All right. Oh yeah, I suppose that's only fair enough. I was just looking at the chat box. I hadn't even noticed that. I was looking at the Q&A box. Why not let participants decide? Yeah. So IRB. Sorry, what's the acronym?
Institutional Review Board. So that's what they're called in the US.
Oh right. Okay. Really.
Yeah.
All right. Why not let the participants decide? Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, voluntary is voluntary. That's the end of the equation. The people who want to complete a survey, there's those, if you're coercing people or if you're telling people I have to do it, you're in the wrong,
Yeah.
you're not going to get the answer, the answers are all skewed, it's biased. People fill out, this may come as a shock, but people fill out stuff wrongly just because they're cheesed off with you. And being fair and equitable is just the way, I think we talked about, or Diego talked about, Emily perhaps, talking about the trust relation. You've got to develop that trust of someone before they're going to trust you with their information. And you've got to be worth that trust. You can't, we're not here to con people or snow people and coerce people, certainly. We've got to be worth the trust that people give us to give that information, to give of themselves, which is what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to that quality of data. If you're wanting to conduct qual research, I'm sort of speaking from that perspective, because that's my passion. The worst thing that I can think that I would do was it would make someone participate in a research study that they wouldn't want to.
Yes.
So, how awful and terrible for them, and how pointless for me to do that, waste my time, waste their time, and not really get any good data out of it. So from that sort of selfish research perspective, as well as just being completely unethical and saying you need to participate in this. So it's a bit different because I sort of do more in-depth sort of focus group work rather than surveys and things like that. So
people complete, like you can see, I've seen surveys completed by people who didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
And why bother? Just throw the survey out. Don't do the survey in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the first part of Lorna's comment, I think it's true. I think that one of the things that a research ethics committee needs to do is to think about, maybe it's not coercion, but undue pressure, right? If it's a particularly vulnerable group, are they going to be in a position where they feel like they can't say no? Prisoner populations are one example, but there are many. That's just one that comes to mind. But I take your point, actually. There is a tendency for individuals who are, say, able-bodied or aren't necessarily part of a vulnerable group XYZ to project further vulnerability or project an inability to make decisions for themselves and to sort of take that paternalistic perspective. So I agree. I think that I think your point's well taken. I think that sometimes it slips from, protecting the individual from harm versus being paternalistic. And yeah, I think that can definitely happen. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any advice on ethics involved with people who are unable to provide informed consent? Yeah, so it's definitely trickier. I'll speak from a general point of view, and then I don't know if Emily and Gren have had experience with this. So usually there's a proxy giving consent on behalf of the individual, and the assumption is that the individual who's giving consent for that other individual to participate in research is doing so from a position of compassion and wanting to, again, do things the right way for the right reasons. But I do think that you need to take seriously as best as possible that individual's ability to say at least no to research. So I think, to Emily and Gren's point a moment ago, you can tell when somebody doesn't want to be in research as well. And I think it's, even if a proxy or a guardian has given you consent, it doesn't mean that it's all systems go. And I think something that sometimes gets lost, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, is this idea that informed consent isn't just that form that you sign. Informed consent is a process, and it's ongoing, right? And so I think that's, I mean, I don't know, that's how I would answer that question, but I'm wondering what, yeah.
Yeah, I personally haven't done any research with disability groups or acquired brain injury, but it's a great question. I think what I try to do is spend the time trying to, you know, talk through the information sheet with, you know, doing research with young people. Sometimes they don't really understand the information sheet anyway. Sometimes they can sign their life away, but they haven't actually read the form. You know, they haven't read the form because, you know, some things come to surprise, you know, to them when you sort of chat through what they're participating in. So I think it's, yeah, building that rapport with your participants and actually really checking in over conversation, whether they're actually willing to participate, whether they have any questions, and keeping it coming back to that, you know, do you have any questions for me? Do you have any questions for me? So that would probably be my approach. Yeah.
Part of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't done any research in intellectual disability, or where the closest I got was in when I was studying with very young children. So I think the youngest person in my PhD that I took data from my PhD was 3 months old, and they were definitely not giving informed consent, but the mother did give informed consent. Couldn't tell if the 3-month-old was into it or not. They were getting, they were quite happy.
There's limits, right? There are limits. And I think that, you know, this is, you know, an example where a research ethics board is there to help you. And, you know, research ethics boards are oftentimes there to work with, research ethics boards are there, not oftentimes. The purpose of a research ethics board is to work with the researcher, right? So it's not a rubber stamp, and it's also not, you know, the power of God to say yes or no to research, right? If they have concerns, a good research ethics committee will work with you. And I think that most will. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I hear, like, you do hear grumbling about research ethics committees, and I've been H-wrecked as a phrase that I've heard. But yeah, my impression is that even the university committees, I haven't worked with the health committees much, but the university committees are there to help you now. They've realized the error of their ways, and they're there to support the researchers. There is the Research Ethics Consultation Committee of CMHDARN, and that is the explicit purpose. And notice the word consultation in there, the explicit purpose of that committee. It's to support you in the process of doing research, to link you in with academics, to do a number of things we've been talking about, and to, you know, discuss with you the ethics of designing and executing research that's going to benefit the community.
So I think there's a really important comment here from Libby about community-led research, right? Libby writes, they know better than anyone else, including HREX, what the potential risk and sensitivity of a research study are. Absolutely. And I think in this space, in most spaces, even drug trials, there's a push towards community involvement. So yeah, absolutely, Libby. I totally agree. It's, you know, it's the best way to try to overcome failure of imagination and inabilities to sort of foresee issues, is to work with the individuals who are going to be subjects, for sure.
Yeah, and I think mentioned briefly before the Indigenous community saying, you know, we've been surveyed and surveyed. I know it's a complex issue, but what has come out of it is that, you know, why are we still involved in this? And perhaps part of the answer to that is maybe we should be designing this stuff.
Absolutely.
Maybe the people, as they say, the people that are affected by the research should be doing it from the start.
And the other thing I think is really interesting is that both in Canada and Australia, you have these independent documents for how to do research with Indigenous communities and the agreements that you need with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities here. And when I read these documents, I'm like, this would be good for any community, right? So I think there's so much to learn. You know, I think sometimes we siphon off racialized communities, or, you know, communities with different physical abilities, intellectual abilities, but they're just good practices for everyone. And I think there's so much to learn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing and perspectives as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's good for all communities and involving that community at the initiation. You're going to say, Emily?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm just thinking back to one of the research projects that we conducted last year, and we ended up going through AH and MRC as well. And, you know, having sort of going in with the teas and having the chats with the Aboriginal Corporation and the elders there was the most important part of understanding what the ethical implications were. It wasn't all the forms that I had to fill out, because there were many. It was actually just that conversation that I was having with the community. Yeah.
Yep. And that is part of what the ethics committees do most of the time. They are there to support and to work with. And again, particularly the ROC, and there's the REC, sorry, it used to be the ROC. And there's also something called the Consumer-Led Research Network in Facebook as well. That's works in mental health AOD research and you know, by and for people affected by those issues.
But to Emily's point, I think there's a comment by Kevin that actually speaks exactly to this point, Emily, which is the trust relationship that you build.
Yep.
You know, it's the treating Kevin Ritz, treating the person as an individual, right? Trust was a guiding factor, and totally, I think that, you know, it's not just good. You know, it's good intrinsically to build that trust. There's good intrinsic reasons why you need to build that trust. It's also instrumentally important. So yeah.
Gives you good research. Yeah, well, I hope the participants enjoyed it. And I know I did. And I want to thank Emily and Diego for an enjoyable discussion today. Interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was great.
Pleasure.
If you have any questions, there we go. Info@CMHDARN Research, as I said, they're there to support you doing research and to do those contacts and networking to talk about. Thank you for your attendance.